Hello, and welcome to Cozy Night Tales, a place to unwind, relax, and drift toward sleep. I'm your host, Michael. Thank you for joining me tonight. We'll ease into a gentle retelling of the classic story Beauty and the Beast, a cozy autumn tale perfect for settling in before bed. Take a moment now to get comfortable and release any tension lingering in your body or mind. As you settle into stillness, allow your breath to lengthen naturally, especially on the exhale. Try to keep your attention on the steady rhythm of your breathing, letting it become a calm and mindful anchor. When I speak to you before each story, I try to share the words I know I want to hear if I were drifting off to sleep with this show. For much of my life, falling asleep has been a challenge. I still have difficult nights now and then, but I've learned to stay patient and avoid letting it overwhelm me. Losing sleep can certainly make the next day harder, but getting frustrated only makes rest more elusive. So as you listen tonight, remember that your breath can help soften any stress or worry. It's a simple, effective way to calm your nervous system and guide yourself into a peaceful night's sleep. This becomes even more powerful when paired with a dreamy bedtime story, like the one we're about to explore. It's a tale as old as time. So without delay, let yourself drift into the world of Beauty and the Beast. There was once a merchant named Laurent who had invested his entire fortune in a fleet of ships, only to lose them all to the sea. A widower. He had no wife to confess this hardship to, but he did have 6 children who had grown accustomed to a comfortable life. As the debts came due and word spread that the family had lost everything, the children struggled with the news. Weeks passed, yet none of the missing ships returned, and Laurent was forced to sell their fine furniture, their carriage, and even his daughter's jewelry and elegant dresses. Eventually, the family left their grand home and moved into a small cottage on the edge of town. Laurent often traveled to meet business contacts, hoping to find partners who might help him rebuild his livelihood. While he was away, his 3 sons and 3 daughters were left to manage the household themselves. Despite being nearly grown, the 3 boys and the 2 eldest daughters were of little help. Years of comfort had left them with few practical skills. Only the youngest daughter, Camille, willingly took on the work required to keep their home running. Whether because of her age or simply her gentle and determined nature, Camille made the greatest effort to learn the essentials of maintaining a household. Although Laurent was well liked among the villagers, his children were not. The 5 eldest made no effort to adjust or to show gratitude, and they did little to earn the goodwill of neighbors who might have supported them. Camille, however, sought advice from the villagers about baking, sewing, gardening, and caring for chickens. Their initial hesitation soon turned into respect as they saw her eagerness to learn and her dedication to helping her family. Over time, she became the thread that held the household together. While her older siblings continued to resist their new circumstances, Camille ensured the home stayed tidy and that meals were prepared. Nearly 2 years passed this way, until one day Laurent received astonishing news. One of his lost ships had arrived in the port with most of its cargo unharmed. The family celebrated, and the older children quickly declared that their life among the villagers was finally at an end. Camille was glad to see her siblings so cheerful, yet the news did not hold the same weight for her as it did for the rest of the family. She had grown fond of their modest cottage, the neat garden, and the warm scent of freshly baked bread. Although she was relieved that her family might soon be content again, she wasn't certain she wished to return to their old life of leisure. She had become someone who valued being helpful. To reclaim his property, Laurent needed to travel to port on horseback, a trip that would take several days. Once there, he planned to arrange the distribution of his recovered goods and then hire a comfortable coach for the return journey. Expecting better days ahead, he asked each of his children what gift they wanted from the city. The older siblings eagerly requested luxury items. Silk shoes with bright buckles, hats decorated with elaborate trims, velvet cloaks, perfumes, and jewelry. Only Camille remained quiet, thinking carefully about her answer. When her father turned to her and encouraged her to speak, she hesitated. "In truth, father, I have always wished to see a rose," she said. "They don't grow in this region, and they are so rare and costly. If you could bring me a single rose, any color, I would love that." He chuckled at his youngest daughter's unusual request, but happily agreed. Privately, he planned to bring her a necklace or some small ornament along with the flower. The weather was pleasant on the morning he set out. Camille packed his saddlebags with food for the journey, sending him off with a tearful smile. Her siblings were far less sentimental. They were accustomed to his frequent travels and cared only about the gifts they expected upon his return. As he rode down the sunlit forest path, Camille remained outside the cottage until he disappeared from view. She felt a faint sense of unease, though she tried to ignore it. After all, their future seemed to be improving. While Lauren's children waited at the cottage, he continued steadily toward the port. Filled with hope that he would reclaim his wealth and social standing, he knew he had suffered serious losses. But with the cargo from the ship, he believed he could rebuild, perhaps even grow a new fleet. His mind wandered to the spices, silks, and other goods he might someday import. It was devastating, then, to arrive and discover his hopes had been shattered. Although the ship had returned with most of its cargo, news of his supposed good fortune traveled quickly. His many creditors had wasted no time. By the time Laurent reached the docks to reclaim his goods, everything had already been seized and sold off to repay his debts. He appealed to one merchant after another, requesting extensions or reconsideration, but no one agreed. By day's end, his debts were gone, but so was everything else. He had nothing left to rebuild his business, and certainly no money to buy the gifts he had promised his children. He was so discouraged that he didn't wish to remain in the city even for the night. Without preparing supplies, checking the weather, or sending any message ahead, Laurent mounted his weary horse and set off along the same provincial road he had followed that morning. A few hours from the city, night fell and a storm swept in. Thunder and lightning cracked overhead as fierce winds tore branches from trees. Laurent's horse panicked and bolted from the main road, carrying him deep into an unfamiliar forest. Realizing too late that traveling at night had been unwise, Laurent searched through the roaring wind for shelter, perhaps a cave or overhang. He had no idea how long his horse wandered in the storm. At last, through the darkness, he noticed a tall stone wall rising ahead. He urged the horse onward, hoping he'd reach the home where he could take shelter. When he reached the stark stone wall, he realized it was not a house at all, but the surrounding wall of a large estate. A tall iron gate stood slightly open. With no time to worry about etiquette, Laurent dismounted and pushed the heavy gate wider so he could lead his horse through. Together, they moved slowly up a paved path stretching into the dark, swirling storm. With leaves whipping around him and rain hitting from every direction, Laurent could barely make out the massive structure rising ahead through the shadows. It was clearly a mansion. Despite the limited visibility, he could see a grand entryway and multiple large rooms with tall windows. It was an intimidating place to arrive uninvited, yet he had no other choice. He doubted he could survive the night without shelter. After tying his horse in a protected alcove, he approached the enormous front door and lifted the iron knocker, letting it fall and echo through the hallway like an answer to the thunder outside. When no one responded, he took a steadying breath and pushed the door open with all his strength. It yielded, and he nearly stumbled into a spacious entrance hall. He lay on the cold stone floor for a moment, catching his breath in the stillness. Hearing the rain pounding outside to the narrow opening in the door, he felt grateful that both he and his horse were under cover. As he stood, he looked around in the dim light. He was in a grand reception area with twin staircases curving upward on either side. Suits of armor stood along the walls, and ahead of him were large, intricately carved double doors. The silence in the house was complete, yet a soft light glowed from the gaps around the doors before him. After calling out a few times with no reply, he gathered his courage and walked toward the lit room, pushing the doors open. Inside, he surveyed the space. A large fire blazed in the wide hearth. In front of it, a table was set for one, with simple dishes, a carafe, and a large glass. He noticed comfortable chairs and small tables piled with books. Still, there was no sign of anyone living there. Laurent sat awkwardly in an armchair, waiting. Soon, however, he couldn't ignore the meal laid out before him. The bread and the scent of roasted meat made his stomach clench with hunger. After several minutes passed, and still no host appeared, he finally gave in. He sat at the table, first taking a small piece of bread, then slowly finishing the entire meal. An hour passed in peaceful silence. Perhaps, he thought, the owner was away and sheltering elsewhere from the storm. Taking a long drink from a glass, he finished the rest of the meal. Yes, he assured himself, the owner would understand in the morning, once he'd eaten everything. Laurent leaned back in his chair and emptied the carafe. The fire flickered warmly before him as he drained the last drop from his cup. He pulled out the letter about his lost ship, a letter that had once filled him with hope, and set it on the table, pushing it aside. Without realizing it, he drifted into a deep sleep. He slept through the night without dreaming. When he awoke in the morning, it took a moment to recall where he was. The fire had long since burned out, and the dishes from the previous night still sat on the table. It seemed the owner had not yet returned. Feeling embarrassed for entering a stranger's home uninvited, his shame got the overcoming his embarrassment. Laurent decided not to wait for the owner to return. Instead, he chose to leave quietly and continue his journey. After all, he told himself, the meal would likely have been wasted otherwise. Rising from the upholstered chair, Laurent crossed the room and pulled open the double doors. A weak morning light filtered into the entryway, illuminating the stark hall far better than the night before. Stepping cautiously into the foyer, he found himself tiptoeing between the towering suits of armor, half expecting them to come to life and block his way. Glancing around at the twin carved staircases, he noticed the worn and dusty carpet runners. It seemed the place had not been lived in for quite some time. He moved quietly across the stone floor to the enormous front door. Grasping the handles, he pulled with all his strength until it slowly opened, revealing a mist-shrouded courtyard. Squeezing to the narrow opening and closing the door behind him, he straightened his waistcoat in an attempt to regain some dignity. Leaving this imposing refuge like a thief did not feel right, but he was determined to put this unsettling journey behind him. Hurrying to the alcove where he had tied his horse the night before, he was relieved to find her safe. Reaching into his saddlebag, he offered her an apple Camille had packed. After untying her, he led the horse down the same stone path he had followed through the storm. When he glanced back, he saw the mansion rising dark and silent in the growing daylight. It was an enormous chateau, long, pale, and rectangular, with a central structure and identical wings on each side. Tall, narrow windows lined both main floors in strict rows, giving the impression that the house was watching him. The sloping tiled roof was crowded with chimneys. Turning away from the intimidating building, Laurent continued toward the gate, passing overgrown gardens on either side. As he neared the end of the walkway, he noticed a charming pergola, thick with rose vines. In the center of a circular seating area stood a rose bush blooming with the most beautiful pink roses he had ever seen. At once he remembered his promise to Camille, wanting to keep his word. He quickly began cutting the roses with the knife he carried. One rose, he felt, would not be enough. Given the circumstances of his return, he intended to take the entire bouquet. So focused on gathering the flowers, He didn't hear the footsteps approaching, but as he stepped back from a now-bare bush, he felt eyes fixed on him. Standing before him was a towering, fearsome-looking man glaring down at him, or at least Laurent assumed he was a man. The figure resembled a human, but thick wild hair covered much of his face, and his large, powerful frame seemed almost unnatural. Dressed in a wrinkled linen shirt and breeches, he looked as though he had rushed over in anger. "What do you think you're doing?" the stranger growled, his voice rough and animal-like. Laurent froze, painfully aware of the flowers in his hand. He stammered that he thought the estate was abandoned and assumed the roses would go unnoticed. When the man's expression didn't soften, he added that he had promised roses to his daughter. The wild-looking figure stood in silence, as though weighing his next words. Then, drawing himself to his full height, he said, "You took advantage of my hospitality without asking. You ate my food. You slept by my fire. All of this I was willing to overlook. But now you have taken every bloom from my most." She gathered her belongings into a small cart, which they fastened to their loyal horse. The chateau's owner examined his damaged rose bush with great displeasure. "This rose bush is of deep personal value to me," he said firmly. "There is no other like it, and each flower is priceless in my eyes. I insist that you compensate me for this." Hearing this, Laurent felt his spirit sink. He shook his head, defeated, and explained that he had nothing to offer. The stern host looked at him without sympathy. "Then you must work off your debt," he replied. "I need laborers here on my estate." Laurent stared at him, searching for another option. "But, sir," he said, "I have 6 children at home. I cannot stay here. What will happen to them?" The man remained unmoved. "Either you repay your debt through labor, or someone in your family must come in your place," he said. "Take your roses. They are of no use to me now. Go home and make your arrangements. I expect you or your replacement within a week. If you fail to appear, I will come for you." With that, the harsh-looking man turned away and walked back toward the house without another glance. Laurent watched him disappear into the chateau. Seeing no alternative, Laurent returned home to explain everything to his children. He hoped that once the man's temper cooled, he might show some understanding and not keep Laurent in service for too long. With the storm over and daylight guiding him, Laurent followed the path back to the main road and continued his journey home. He rode steadily but slowly, thinking of the difficult news he would have to deliver. It was a beautiful day. The mist had lifted, and the early autumn sun shone warmly, feeling strangely out of place. Birds sang as if nothing were wrong, but Laurent's heart was heavy, and he dreaded the conversation ahead. He reached home late that night. His children greeted him eagerly, expecting the gifts he had promised. They reached into his saddlebags with excitement, only to find that instead of fine items, he presented each of them with a single rose. Camille smelled hers with delight, admiring its beauty, but the other 5 children demanded their true presents. That night, crowded around the kitchen table, Laurent explained everything that had happened on his troubled trip to the port city. He described the loss of his remaining money and the circumstances that had led to his obligation to the owner of the mysterious chateau. When he finished and told them he would have to return to work off the debt, the older siblings were upset. They complained, asking how they were expected to manage without him. Only Camille remained quiet. She sat deep in thought, her expression unreadable. Finally, she called for silence. Her siblings turned to her in surprise, as she rarely offered her opinion. Camille then announced that she would go to the chateau in her father's place. Laurent's eyes filled with tears. He insisted that he could not allow it, but Camille's clear reasoning was difficult to oppose. Their father was needed at home to care for family. She, however, could be spared. She also had basic household skills and could handle whatever cooking or cleaning was required of her. There was no other reasonable choice She concluded she would be the one to repay the family's debt. It took a day or two for Camille to gather her few belongings. Seeing that the rose her father had given her was beginning to wilt, she pressed it between the pages of a book, wanting a reminder of why she was leaving home to work for a stern stranger on a distant, secluded estate. Although nervous about leaving everything familiar, she was determined to make her father proud. On the morning of her departure, the sky was bright and clear. Camille and Laurent set out. It took 2 days of walking, with the horse pulling the cart, before Laurent and Camille reached an inn he knew along the route where they could spend the night. As they prepared to leave home, the siblings gathered outside the cottage to see them off. Their expressions held a mix of relief and quiet admiration, grateful that they would not be left alone to manage for long. The journey was subdued for both Laurent and Camille. The first day passed under pleasant weather, and their stay at the inn was simple and uneventful. However, the second day brought colder winds and a dreary atmosphere as autumn began to settle over the forest. Dry brown leaves drifted across their path, and the wind moved restlessly through the trees, while their steady horse carried them closer to their destination. When Laurent finally saw the turnoff that led to the chateau, his heart grew heavier with each step. Sensing her father's distress, Camille gathered her strength and offered him a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, father," she said softly. "I am capable. I'll manage." He nodded, hoping she was right. Before long, they reached the dark entrance to the estate. Laurent knew the moment had arrived. He pushed the gate open once more, led the horse through, and approached the imposing mansion. For the second time, he faced the forbidding structure. Camille stared wide-eyed at the vast gardens and towering stone walls. Everything was larger and more severe than anything she had ever known. Yet the harsh beauty of the estate struck her. Growing up in a small village had not prepared her for such grandeur. She felt overwhelmed, but also aware of the mystery and permanence of place. The stones themselves seemed to rest as though waiting to be noticed again. She wondered what work she would be expected to do, and hoped she would be up to the task. Laurent stopped the horse at the broad front steps. The wind pushed against them, almost urging them away from the entry. Camille slowly climbed the steps, lifted the heavy door knocker, and let it fall. Father and daughter waited, expecting the stern master of the house to appear. Instead, the door opened to reveal a boy of about 13, simply dressed like any village child. He peeked out with open curiosity, studying them closely. Satisfied, he asked, "Is one of you the new servant?" Laurent, surprised for a moment, said he had come to bring his daughter, Camille, who would work off the dead in his place. The boy nodded as if this were entirely normal, pulled the door wider, and motioned for her to come in. He told Laurent he could leave Camille's belongings in the front hall, then dash back into the depths of the house, likely to announce her arrival. With the wind at her back, Camille stepped through the doorway and into the beginning of her new life. The farewell between father and daughter was emotional, though they both tried to stay composed. Laurent turned the horse toward home under the heavy skies, not looking back until they had passed beyond the estate gates. The forest trees soon closed behind them. Camille remained in the wide, echoing hallway, unsure of what to do next. Gray daylight filtered through the tall windows above the door, offering little warmth. She stood near her trunk and reminded herself that she needed to stay strong and do her best. A few minutes later, the boy reappeared, announcing that the Baron had instructed him to take her to her room. Cheerfully, he lifted her trunk and began hauling it up the large curved staircase. Camille followed him in silence. Camille was surprised to discover they were heading upstairs rather than down toward a kitchen or servants' quarters. She assumed she might be staying in an attic room, but to her astonishment, the boy turned into the first grand hallway. They walked along the plushly carpeted east wing of the chateau, their quiet footsteps passing portraits of nobles from long past eras. Their painted eyes seemed fixed on her, as though she were an unexpected visitor in their permanent home. Camille was so focused on the paintings that she almost bumped into the boy when he stopped at the door and pushed it open. She stepped inside and was taken aback to find a beautifully furnished bedroom. It was not overly large, and the decor was modest, but the canopied bed, fine textiles, and polished with details made it far more luxurious than anything she had known. While she examined the space, spotting a soft window seat and a small dressing table, the boy knelt to start a fire in the hearth. When the wood began to crackle, he stood and brushed off his hands with a cheerful grin. "I'm Gabriel," he said. "I help the Baron with different tasks around here. I'm glad you've come. It can get a bit lonely, and I could use another set of hands for the daily work." Camille hesitated, unsure what that daily work might be, but she thanked him for the fire and asked when she would meet her employer. Gabriel replied that the Baron planned to see her the next day and would explain her duties then. For now, he would bring her a simple supper and hoped she would rest well. With that, he slipped out of the room and closed the door quietly behind him. Camille took a moment to steady herself, then began unpacking. She hung her clothes in the large wardrobe and placed her few books on the table beside the bed. Opening the top volume, she looked at the pink rose pressed between its pages and smiled sadly before closing it again. She moved to the window, pulled the heavy curtains aside, and settled into the cushioned window seat. From there, she could see the courtyard, its gardens growing freely around the paths and climbing the stone walls of the chateau. Evening was arriving, and the wind scattered leaves and debris across the paving stones, lifting them briefly into small spirals. Dark clouds drifted across the rising moon. Tired from the long journey and the unfamiliar surroundings, she drifted into a light sleep tucked within the curtains. A knock at the door woke her. She stepped out of the window seat, steadied her breathing, and opened it to find a tray on the floor. It held a simple meal: bread, cheese, soup, and hot tea. There was no one in sight. Gabriel moved quietly. That much was clear. She carried the tray inside and placed it on the table near the fire. Hunger overtook her, and she finished every bite. Without much thought for bedtime routines, she pulled back the covers, crawled into the warm bed, and was asleep within moments. That night, she dreamed oddly. She wandered the dark halls of the chateau, following a large dog. The animal slipped in and out of rooms, appearing again seconds later in the corridor. Each time she tried to follow, it moved ahead. Finally, she reached the doorway where it had just disappeared. She looked into the room, expecting the dog, but instead saw the back of a man seated at a desk. He began to turn in his chair, but before his face came into view, she woke abruptly. Sitting upright, she saw the fire had burned low and morning light was entering her window. As she gathered her thoughts, a knock sounded. Gabriel stood outside, holding a tray. "Good morning, Miss Camille," he said politely. "I've brought your breakfast." Then, gesturing toward the entrance hall, he added, "The Baron asks that you meet him in his study when you have finished." Camille nodded to the boy. The boy took the tray and disappeared again. An hour later, Camille stood nervously outside the same room where her father had once eaten his uninvited fireside meal. She heard papers rustling inside. Clearing her throat, she tapped softly on the door. The sound stopped, and a chair scraped the floor. Moments later, the man with the heavy beard appeared. His features were unusually pronounced, and his face seemed fixed in a natural scowl. He was an intimidating figure, but Camille kept her expression composed. She bowed her head politely. The large man looked her over for a moment, then nodded stiffly in return. He motioned for her to sit in a chair by the fire, and he lowered himself into the seat opposite her. "So, you are the one who will repay your father's debt," he said. "Are you familiar with basic household duties? Cleaning, cooking, things of that sort?" Camille nodded. The man seemed satisfied. He picked up a heavy ring of keys from a nearby table. As you can see, I have very little help here. Gabriel assists with my basic needs. His mother provides bread, milk, and eggs each day, and he handles errands in town. But aside from myself, there is no one else to manage this estate. I'm sure the condition of the house has already shown you that. It is far too much work for just 2 people, but we will manage. He paused, waiting for a reply. Camille was overwhelmed by the idea of being the sole housekeeper in such a large mansion, but she saw no point in objecting. These keys will open most rooms, he continued. You will not need all of them. If you require something Gabriel cannot get, speak to me. Otherwise, I prefer that you make your own decisions about the household. I spend most of my time in my study or the library. Stunned by the scope of her responsibilities, Camille simply nodded. Sensing the conversation was over, he stood abruptly. Camille rose as well, accepted the old keys from him, and gave a brief bow. As she reached the door, he called after her, "Dinner is at 7. It would be sensible for you to join me in the dining room." Camille thanked him and stepped out into the echoing hall. She felt both lost in the enormous space, and as though it was closing in around her. Spreading the heavy keys across her palm, she studied them quietly. She had no idea what each one opened, but their weight carried a sense of responsibility. She was pulled from her thoughts when Gabriel emerged from the shadows. Smiling warmly, he asked if she would like a tour. Camille gratefully agreed, and so began her life as the chateau's housekeeper. Gabriel explained that the Baron had lived alone for many years. Because of his fierce appearance, people in the surrounding area feared him. They gossiped about him unkindly and avoided him in public. Gabriel was his only link to the outside world. He had first been sent to run errands for the Baron years earlier, but had grown to understand and appreciate the man behind the intimidating exterior. He insisted that the Baron's bark was far worse than his bite. Now, Gabriel spent each day at the estate handling tasks he could manage, then returned to his family's small home outside town each night. "Truly, miss," he assured her, "the Baron is fair and good-hearted." Gabriel then led Camille through the numerous rooms and long corridors of the chateau, most of which showed clear signs of neglect. Many chambers along the dark hallways were unused. Camille's keys opened room after room filled with dust-covered furniture, cold fireplaces, and forgotten belongings. Some spaces have been untouched for decades, perhaps even centuries. The unused rooms were thick with cobwebs, and the windows let in only dim light through panes clouded by years of grime. As Camille soon learned, only a handful of spaces were used each day, and these were the ones she needed to focus on: the kitchen, the Baron's study, and the front entryway. The most impressive space, however, was the library. Gabriel allowed Camille to look inside, while the Baron was occupied elsewhere, and she was stunned by what she saw. It was a vast room with towering ceilings and gold accents. Bookcases rose all the way to the top, covering every wall except the few where windows stood. Sliding ladders rested at either end, ready to help any visitor reach the highest shelves. Books were everywhere, so many she couldn't imagine counting them. Their spines ranged in deep reds, greens, blues, and browns, each silently inviting her to reach out and explore. Camille loved reading the few books she had kept during her father's financial troubles, but she had never seen a library like this. According to Gabriel, the Baron spent much of his time here, and it certainly looked that way. Tables throughout the room were stacked with open volumes or group collections. 2 well-worn leather chairs suggested long hours spent reading. Gabriel mentioned that he was responsible for keeping the fire lit in the large hearth during the day. Camille pictured herself opening one of the many books, settling into a soft chair, and breathing the scent of old ink and paper. It was a tempting thought. Still, she knew the only way to improve the state of the house was to choose a place and begin. On the first day, she and Gabriel dusted and swept the front hall and cleaned the kitchen. Gabriel and the Baron had managed simple meals there for years, but the room needed much more care. Camille wasn't an expert cook, but she enjoyed restoring the space. She sent Gabriel to town with a list of supplies, then stood alone in the quiet kitchen and began her work. She cleared and used counters, polished pots and pans, and brought life back to the cold room. By the time dinner approached, she had prepared a basic roasted chicken. It wasn't elaborate, but she was satisfied with it. With barely a moment to tidy herself, Camille returned to her room. Gabriel had rekindled the fire, and she used her washstand to freshen up before putting on her best dress. When she walked to the window to close the drapes, she paused. The courtyard outside was silent, perfectly still. Not even a bird moved. It felt as though the grounds were held in a quiet enchantment. She drew the velvet curtains together thoughtfully before stepping away. There was much she still didn't understand about the estate, she reminded herself. Lighting a candle, she walked down the dim hallway and descended the wide staircase. The large dining room doors opened into a space far too grand for only two people. Once, it must have hosted elegant gatherings and elaborate dinners. Camille looked up at the crystal chandelier hanging overhead like a cluster of stars. Gabriel had set two places at one end of the long table, and the meal was waiting. She arrived first and didn't have to wait long. The Baron's towering figure appeared in the doorway. He paused, nodded briefly, and motioned toward the two place settings. Camille took one of the cushioned seats. "I can see you've been busy with Gabriel today," the Baron remarked, raising his brows at the hearty meal she had prepared. "He has carried a heavy load these past years as my only help. He gave a small nod. "I'm glad you'll be here to take on some of his work." Camille nodded back, unsure how to respond. "When should I address you as my lord?" she asked politely. He paused and shook his head. "Please, just call me Antoine," he replied. "I am the lord of nothing now. Only of this chateau and its collection of dusty relics," he added dryly. Then he met her gaze. "I'm sorry you had to come here under such circumstances, but I hope you'll be comfortable. I try to be fair, and I'm grateful for the company." Camille nodded and offered a faint smile. "Would you like me to tidy the library tomorrow?" she asked. I wasn't sure if he preferred that I avoid the room. The Baron considered this briefly and agreed that would be fine. Then he added, "You are welcome to borrow any book you like. As Descartes said, reading good books is like having a conversation with the greatest minds of past centuries. You'll find that my library has an unusual ability to offer almost any book you can imagine. It is rather magical in that way." Surprised by his generosity and refined way of speaking, Camille quietly observed her unconventional employer as they ate. She had been at the chateau for only a day, yet her perception of her situation was already shifting. She had become the caretaker of a large home, free to manage her duties as she wished, and now she had access to an extraordinary library. Perhaps this unexpected turn of events would not be as bleak as she had once feared. She looked down at her plate, the firelight flickering softly, and listened to the gentle clink of silverware against china. They spoke very little during dinner, finishing their meal in respectful silence. Later, as she settled beneath the crisp white sheets of her grand canopy bed, Camille felt a growing sense of hope. This secluded estate seemed likely to hold many intriguing secrets, and she looked forward to discovering them. Turning onto her side, she glanced sleepily at the drapes pulled tightly across the window. Somewhere within the chateau, a warmth lingered, something that made the place feel alive. The next morning, after straightening the kitchen, Camille made her way cautiously to the library. She knew the Baron was working in another study, and it seemed a good moment to explore the remarkable room under pretense of cleaning. Taking a duster in hand, she moved slowly through the space, weaving between stacks of books and tables, brushing away the film of dust that had settled over time. Just as she was about to shift a stack of volumes, Antoine appeared in the doorway. "Please don't move any piles or open books," he said. Camille stepped back from the stack and apologized, but he reassured her. "No need to apologize. I know it looks disorganized. It's just that I'm in the middle of research and don't want to lose track of anything." He then asked whether she had chosen a book for herself. She admitted she hadn't and wondered if he might recommend one. Camille confessed she felt unprepared to read such significant works, coming from a far more modest background. Antoine smiled and spread his hands. Recognizing one's own ignorance is the beginning of wisdom. Seeing her puzzled expression, he winked lightly. "That bit comes from Socrates." He crossed the room, retrieved a small book from a lower shelf, and handed it to her. "Perhaps you'd enjoy more of his ideas." He believed strongly in asking many questions. Camille accepted the book with a grateful nod and prepared to leave the room. But before she stepped out, she turned back with a hesitant inquiry. "Would it be possible to hire some villagers to help tidy the gardens before winter?" she asked. Antoine's face fell slightly, and he gave a small shrug. "If Gabriel can find anyone willing to come onto the estate, you may certainly arrange it. Sadly, most people are too frightened to set foot within the chateau's walls. Too many strange tales. People have repeated stories about me for years," he continued, "which is why I spend most of my time alone." Camille frowned. "How can you endure that? Doesn't it anger you to be judged so unfairly?" The Baron looked down, thinking carefully before answering. "I was once a handsome man and a vain, foolish one. It took a great misfortune to make me see my mistakes. The way people treat me now is, in many ways, fair payment for my past faults." Camille didn't reply. She held back further questions, though she was determined to learn how her employer had come to be in such an unfortunate situation. For the moment, she simply looked forward to reading Socrates in her room after dinner. Over the next weeks, Camille adjusted quickly to life as the chateau's housekeeper, and even grew fond of it. Through gentle persuasion and a few small bribes, she convinced Gabriel to hire several village men to help clear the gardens of years of overgrowth. She made sure they understood one important rule. They were not to harm the rose bush near the pergola. It had been planted by Antoine's mother and held great meaning for him. She almost regretted hiring the workers when she overheard them speaking harshly about Antoine. "They say he's a complete monster," one man declared loudly. "Lives like a beast in there," another added. "No manners at all. Barely fit for human company. But I'll take his money," he finished crudely. Camille noticed Antoine standing by the window, having heard every word. She rushed to close it, hoping to shield him from their cruelty. He waved her away, seemingly unbothered. "I'm used to that sort of talk," he said. "It's been many years since I could move easily in society." Camille, however, was troubled. "How can you accept such unfairness? How can you not hate people who judge you without knowing you?" He shrugged, looking thoughtfully at a stack of books on the table. "A great English playwright, William Shakespeare, wrote, 'Heat not a furnace for your foes so hot that it do singe yourself.' By showing goodwill toward people who misunderstand me, I lighten my own burden." He gave her a small smile. "You might enjoy reading Shakespeare. His plays are excellent." With that, he returned to his books, leaving Camille to ponder his words in the gray afternoon outside. Despite the constant work that filled her days, Camille still found time to explore the estate. As autumn settled in with crisp air, early nights, and cold evenings, she wandered the dim halls with candle, using her heavy ring of keys to discover what lay behind the many closed doors. Most rooms were bedrooms, long and used. It was clear the chateau had once hosted noble guests. Room after room revealed elegant four-poster beds, fine furniture, and chairs hidden beneath dusty covers. One afternoon, she discovered a particularly striking chamber. It had clearly been a lady's room, and unlike the others, it still contained all her belongings. A graceful dressing table stood near the window, covered with powder jars and tiny perfume bottles that glittered in the soft light. Several elaborate wigs from decades past rested on their stands, as though waiting to be worn to a grand ball. When Camille opened the wardrobe, she was astonished to find a row of lavish silk gowns, fashioned in the style worn before the Revolution. She ran her hand gently across their delicate skirts, almost afraid they might crumble under her touch. She imagined the refined woman who must have worn them. Inside the chest of drawers, she found shimmering necklaces. One small velvet case held a ring crowned with a sparkling sapphire. Closing the box, she slid the drawer shut quietly. She had no wish to appear as though she meant to steal anything. With a reluctant sigh, she stepped back out of the room and locked it. It felt like a doorway to a happier era, and it was easily the most beautiful discovery she had made in the house yet. Seen around the house, Camille faithfully wrote letters to her father, which Gabriel delivered to town whenever he ran errands. In them, she assured her father that she was being treated well and that she enjoyed her work. Before long, she was even able to send him a little money. After her first month, the Baron told her he couldn't let her continue working without pay, as the damage to the rose bush had long been compensated for. He said he hoped she would remain at the estate and that he would provide a weekly salary for her efforts. Camille happily accepted. As Antoine's housekeeper, she felt she had finally found her calling. All her organizational talents were put to excellent use, and the pleasant company, along with access to his remarkable library, became her greatest joys. In fact, it became easy to forget that Antoine was considered unattractive. Nothing about his appearance had truly changed, aside from Camille ensuring his clothes were cleaner and more presentable. Yet every now and then, she would catch a glimpse in a mirror and see an ordinary, pleasant-looking man reflected back as he passed. Or she would be speaking with him, and suddenly he would no longer seem covered in hair, his features appearing more balanced. She would blink a few times, refocus, and see the same intimidating figure as before. Perhaps, she thought wryly, the strange magic of the chateau was affecting her mind. From time to time, a beggar would appear at the door, the harsh winter wind pushing him behind him. Unaware of the estate's reputation, these visitors expected little. In her own village, beggars were usually turned away, with people insisting they deserved their misfortune and that hard-working individuals never ended up in such a state. Camille assumed Antoine would dismiss them as well. Instead, he would tell her to give the beggars several coins before they left. Moved by his generosity, Camille eventually asked why he showed such kindness, especially when no one nearby offered him any in return. Once again, he referred to a philosopher he admired, this time Aristotle, saying, "It is the mark of a magnanimous man to ask no favor, but be ready to show kindness." Then, with a hint of sadness, he added, "I must learn to be more magnanimous, for it was my earlier life that brought me to ruin." He gave no further explanation, though Camille longed to understand what had happened to him. That evening, they talked comfortably in the candlelit dining room over a warm winter stew. It was then that Camille found the courage to ask how he had come to live so isolated in the chateau. Antoine hesitated, sighing and leaning back in his chair before taking a long drink. At last he began his story. "Many years ago, I lived here with my mother. My father died when I was a young man, and that is how I became lord of this estate. I love my mother dearly. She was beautiful in every way, full of life, and kind to everyone. The rose bush your father clipped belonged to her." Antoine paused, visibly uncomfortable, then continued. "When my mother fell ill and passed away, I was left to manage things on my own. I'm ashamed to admit that I did not live well. I was inexperienced and foolish. I wasted our family's money on extravagant items and senseless parties. I neglected the estate ignored unpaid bills, and failed my employees. Without my mother's influence, I slipped into an irresponsible life and became of little worth to anyone, including myself. One night, a servant told me a woman was at the door asking for food and coin. I was in the middle of a lavish party and didn't want to be disturbed. I told him to suggest she find employment elsewhere. At this memory, Antoine grimaced, clearly troubled by his own words. Before the servant could turn her away, she forced her way through the door and told me that my foolish vanity had brought a curse upon me. She declared that She said I would spend my days shunned and unloved, and that the key to my freedom could only be found in humanity. At this, Camille frowned. Humanity? What did she mean by that? Antoine shrugged. That is the riddle I've tried to solve for decades. I seem to have an endless number of books in my library, works by great philosophers, mathematicians, and poets. All the wisdom humanity has created is within reach. Likely another part of this strange enchantment. My mind has improved, but all this knowledge is yet to reveal a way to break my curse. Camille studied him from across the table. The soft crackling of the fire filled the quiet room, and she imagined him sitting beside many fires over the years with no one to speak to. She wondered how long he had lived here alone, turning to the pages of countless books in search of redemption. Antoine brightened, trying to ease the somber mood. As the great Isaac Newton said, to arrive at the simplest truth requires years of contemplation. Perhaps one day I'll find the answer. Later, curled up on her bed, Camille felt she had finally connected the pieces. For years, Antoine had been studying, reflecting, learning, and regretting his past actions. He was no longer someone who would deny kindness to anyone, even those who might not deserve it. Yet she still wondered what more he could do. Would he remain here forever with only his books and the fading reminders of the man he used to be? She hoped not, because she had grown to truly respect him. Pulling the blanket closer around her chin, she watched the last glow of the fire fade and drifted into sleep, surrounded by the quiet of the house. Throughout the bitter winter, Camille and Antoine continued their routines at the chateau in comfortable companionship, with Gabriel serving as their steady link to the outside world. Many of the large mansion's rooms remained locked and unused, but the spaces they needed were warm and orderly thanks to Camille's careful management. Their meals were simple but satisfying. Snow piled high in the courtyard, and cold winds sometimes whistled through the empty halls. But the three kept close to fireplaces, absorbed in their reading. Eventually, the first signs of spring appeared. Around that time, Camille received a letter from her father. He wrote that her eldest sister had secured a marriage arrangement, and the wedding would take place in a few weeks. He asked whether the Baron might allow Camille to take some leave, so she could tend. If so, Laurent would gladly travel to the estate to collect her. When Camille shared the request with Antoine, he set down his book and looked at her with a gentle, somewhat sad smile. He told her, of course, she must go, and she should take as much time as needed. As Camille thanked him, she again did not see a beast before her, only a man. She blinked several times before the illusion faded. Leaving the room, she paused briefly to glance back at him, then continued on, letting the moment slip away. Her trip to her sister's wedding was uneventful. Her family welcomed her with curiosity and perhaps a new degree of respect. They admired the modest but elegant clothing she had purchased with her wages. It was clear that the money she had been sending home had helped secure her sister's marriage, humble though the match was. Her family was no longer viewed by the villagers as poor. Instead, they were seen as stable and respectable thanks to her steady income. And yet, Camille felt less at home in the family cottage than she once had. Even though she had spent all her recent months inside the chateau, she felt her outlook had shifted and her sense of the world had greatly expanded.